First and foremost, Simon Zadek, the Chair of Finance for Biodiversity. Secondly, Ruchi Nanda, the US Capitals Markets Senior Industry Advisor from Microsoft. And Dr. Frank Denanzanes, who's the President and CTO of Earth Knowledge. Welcome all of you to this Green Horizon Summit on Nature, and thank you for your time. We've heard a lot from the youth panel and the challenges they see with nature, and it's great to see youth voices really leading the way with nature, as has been the case with climate. But one of the things I just wanted to go through in a bit more detail was that interconnection between nature and climate that they were discussing. And Frank, I wanted to turn to you first and foremost. I was hoping you could explain to us in a little bit more detail why it is so crucial for firms to take action on both of these topics.
Yeah, sure, Katie. Much. Actually, I think Sir David Attenborough did a really great job in his opening remark at COP, when he talked about how, the planet itself is really a finely tuned life support system. And he pointed out how, over the course of the Holocene, which was really probably one of the most stable periods in the Earth's history, that, for a period of like 1,000 years, the temperature varied really less than 1 degree Celsius. So, this world that we live on, and also diversity is really the key to a very stable life system. And that includes everything from, like forests to phytoplankton. And between carbon and the carbon is kept in a balance, and the temperatures are kept. Even things like massive herds and of herbivores that walk across grasslands, they're cultivating the land and fertilizing millions of hectares with carbon, and that carbon is carefully stored in the life of the planet. And so that balance of carbon stored in the life systems of the planet keep things like water and all in this perfect balance, and that's really what leads to the stability and the rhythm that we see or have seen in the past planet. So the garden, the Holocene really created this Garden of Eden, and it's that Eden that we evolved from. The conditions were perfect for us to basically become the great human condition that we are. Unfortunately, the Garden of Eden also gave us a lot of time to think, and with that intelligence, we created the ability to drastically alter this system. So, the responsibility falls on us then to bring balance into the carbon cycle, to bring balance into the cycle and all the interrelationships of these Earth systems. We have to wield probably the other most powerful tool that we've created through our intelligence, and that's really the financial system. And we have to basically take that now and utilize it to utilize nature-based solutions to respond to increased carbon emissions and increases of carbon in the atmosphere. And by utilizing those nature-based solutions, we're effectively bringing both that carbon and those natural systems back into balance. It's really going to be the world's financial system that has the will to bring that balance back into the position that it needs to be.
Thanks for that, Frank. And that is a point very well made. Financial services are really controlling how we drive this planet, whether it's through the decisions they make with credit or investments, or even from an insurance perspective with what we underwrite. But Simon, I wanted to turn over to you and ask you about What do you think financial firms need to do in the short, medium, and long term to address some of these challenges with nature and to take?
Thanks very much indeed. So I'll build off of, I think most of Frank's points, perhaps putting aside whether the financial is one of our great achievements. That's perhaps for a slightly longer and richer debate. There's no doubt that you're right, that finance drives the global, not vice versa. And so when Alok Sharma said in some of his opening comments to COP26, we need to redesign the financial system so that it is suited to the transition that we know is needed. He echoed the views of many other leading actors in the financial space, from speeches that Mark Carney has made over a number of years, and also comments, for example, that Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF managing director, has made similarly a number of times. So lots to really, but really the question is, what can we do in the financial economy? We've heard Andrew Mitchell in the previous session and throughout COP so far of the Advent Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, the shoulders of TCFD, and driving metrics, risk management processes, strategy, governance, disclosure around nature risks into the corporate sector and therefore into the disclosure of information that is relevant to the financial community. The financial community has to raise its game in handling that data and how it fits in to will need to be an extended and integrated risk management approach, i.e. pulling climate and nature together. You know, what we don't want, of course, is a sort of a net zero risk management tool and a positive risk management. That's not really going to help us all. And again, as Andrew Mitchell said in the previous session, there's no doubt that, you know, as energy is to carbon, food in many ways is nature. And so the big transformations are likely to happen, of course, not exclusively in the food system space, but significantly in the food system space. And of course, many institutions are heavily invested through all different channels in food. And so here, the only thing, of course, that we know is disrupting the energy system is one thing, disrupting the food system is a very different kind of agenda, given the public good issues at stake, food security, price spiking, and so on. What else is happening in the financial system, or that bears on FIs will increasingly take of nature? Well, of course, we have the network of central banks for greening the financial system, NGFS, now 90 central bank financial regulators around the world, moving or extending their lens from carbon to climate and from climate to biodiversity. And they've finished the second round of work and will be pushing forward the first set of scenarios that will drive transition risk pathways and begin to nature in that kind of long-term view of stability, which will ultimately cascade down into actions by some financial regulators, standard setters, stock exchanges, credit rating agencies, and so forth. So we'll begin to see the market infrastructure sensitizing itself to nature. Challenge, much like carbon, and is not whether that's going to happen quickly and effectively. That's going to happen. One of the interesting things that differentiates nature from carbon is that destroying nature is often illegal, whereas emitting too much carbon in general not illegal. And so actually we have a raft of regulations that are there that need to be purposed more carefully to how the financial community takes nature into account. And the most obvious section, although there are many of them if we have to discuss, is really the link between anti-money laundering rules and crime. Now, we know that a significant portion of deforestation around the largest treasures are illegal. Biased environmental regulations don't necessarily capture, let alone prevent that deforestation happening. There are moves afoot in Europe, in the UK, now also the US, to begin to broaden the lens and application of anti-money laundering rules, not just to wildlife, which is historically where it has been targeted, but to a much wider array of nature crimes, including, of course, illegal deforestation. And one could imagine, thinking forward, something perhaps similar to the conflict diamonds model, or the anti-slavery model, or the anti-corruption model, where companies need to and demonstrate that their financing value is simply clear of nature crimes, which at the moment is something that they are not in shape or form required to do unless it concerns illicit financial flows coming across their own balance sheet. So in conclusion, I would say TNFD, definitely a core piece of the story: risk management, disclosure, market efficiency measures. Central banks and financial regulators looking at it from a macro point of view, much as they have increasingly done in space, that will move much more quickly because of experience. More broadly, a set of environmental rules, particularly involving illegal nature destruction, kind of feed back through a number of existing mechanisms, AML rules, onto balance sheets of financial institutions, and then really just that not exclusive but critical sectoral focus on food and the question of how the food transition model work in a way that reduces damage of nature, less emissions, and yet maintains a basic objective of delivering affordable nutrition for all. Very much.
Thanks very much, Simon. And you've laid out so many big actions and activities that financial services are going to have to undertake and consider there. But whenever I reflect on it, I think, well, actually, a lot of my clients are still finding it hard to get on top of the requirements for climate that have been with us for a bit longer. So, Ruchi, I was hoping to turn to you and to get a bit of an understanding from you as to what you think the barriers or challenges for financial services firms really will be as they get to grips with the challenges of nature.
Sure, it's a great question. And I'll echo a lot of what Simon and Frank have mentioned before, but introduce a slightly different point of view. I think financial services firms will address biodiversity loss when they address E, S, and G comprehensively, or together we can think of as sustainable investing. Biodiversity loss is extremely important, but it's part of a broader set of criteria, such as corporate actions, board governance, employee treatment, that firms are integrating into their investment decision-making. So Simon mentioned this, the question really is are these firms currently best positioned to drive real change in the area of sustainability? So, one of the first challenges I would name is the materiality of sustainability itself. Firms understand that they have a fiduciary duty first, but many haven't related the fiduciary duty to sustainability. And if we take again the example of loss, the World Economic Forum ranks biodiversity loss as one of the top 5 risks in the next decade. But how many investors specifically understand how that impacts their portfolio? So until investors can do that, and until investors demand companies to incorporate sustainable values into their business strategies, there will always be a disparity between what's right and what's right for shareholders. So, I think to the emerging markets, it was mentioned this week, the transition finance gap in the emerging markets is the largest. These areas also be very carbon intensive. So ideally, activist management, direct capital flows to transitory technologies in these markets would be extremely helpful. But firms tend to invest less in these areas because of the carbon intensity level. And that doesn't align to a carbon sensitive portfolio strategy. So when I think about it, what I think we need is what happened at ExxonMobil to become the norm for real change. So if you recall, BlackRock advocated several hedge fund candidates from engine number one to join Exxon's board. And this was specifically to pressure the company to lower their carbon footprint, invest in renewable strategies. And that was that Exxon had concerns for some time until this happened. So, that's very important stakeholder activism. The second challenge I'll mention is the ambiguous standards to report and verify sustainability metrics. The area of sustainability is so broad. We talk about biodiversity loss, climate. There are all of these terms that are associated with. And so I was surprised to learn that there are over 15 metrics to just report carbon emissions. And to further complicate that, if you want to do this accurately and you're considering the supply and value chain, you need to consider a supplier and every user. And so if stakeholders aren't demanding it, how is a company supposed to convince a supplier that they need to be transparent as well? As you can imagine, these complexities impede financial services from allocating capital in a way that truly supports long-term sustainability, resilience, adaptation, instead of simply joining this investment frenzy going on.
Thank you very much, Ruchi, for that insight into some of the barriers and challenges. And indeed, there are many, with even the sheer number of metrics, as you pointed out, are going to be a bunch. Now, I want to take a moment just to bring up a video to show you what our youth panel were thinking on this topic. Welcome to this Green Horizon Summit panel on natural capital. Now, I can almost hear you thinking, why are we talking about natural capital? I thought COP26 was supposed to be about climate. Well, you're going to learn all about it through this session and why they're interlinked. But to provide a little bit of a baseline or context for it, I want to set the scene. So about 3/4 of the land on the planet and about 2/3 of the marine environment have been heavily impacted by human activity. We've lost almost half the world's forests and coral reefs and about 85% of the wetlands. But why does that matter for financial services? Quite simply, natural capital, or the world's stocks of natural assets, provide benefits to people in the form of ecosystem services, for example, food or water quality regulation. And so as a result, over 50% of the world's economy is moderately or highly reliant on nature. And in fact, in the FTSE 100 alone, of the 18 sectors that are represented, 13 of them are highly or very highly reliant on production processes, reliant on nature. But I don't think anybody has put that issue into context quite as well as the Dasgupta review, which stated that our economies are within nature, not external to it. So now that I've set the scene a bit, the plan for this panel event today is that it will have two halves. The first half, we're going to hear from a number of youth voices in this space. The youth voices across the globe have really been driving action on climate. So it's probably not surprising that they're doing the same on nature. And then the second half of the event, we're going to hear from individuals who are working with financial services to help make them nature positive. But for now, I would love to introduce you to our youth panel, which is composed of 6 people. We've got Claire Adamson, Benjamin Wishart, Tom Maidment, Patrick Cavini, Lincoln Lee, and Ellie King. So to kick it off, first question, Claire, can I ask you this question, which is, why is taking action on nature so important?
Hi, thank you, Katie. Biodiversity is closely linked to climate change. So if you keep damaging biodiversity, it's grossly contributing to climate change and the heating of the planet, which I think everyone knows is so dangerous. So for me in particular, I was really impacted when I was traveling around Asia, and I was able to look at different islands and visit different islands around Hong Kong and see firsthand what happens when you kind of damage biodiversity. So there, the food supplies were ruined from increased sea levels, people having to move away, completely desert these islands and move towards central Hong Kong. And I think it's been in the news about biodiversity loss and climate change for decades now, but a lot of people, it's not really drilled into the fact that it will be affecting everyone, because everyone is so closely linked. Like global trade has increased for the past century. So if it affects one country or even one kind of small area of the world, it has a knock-on impact to everyone. And that's really, really dangerous. Like as we've seen of COVID-19, these kind of emergency states that we go through, it's just not good for society. It's not what everyone wants to be in. No one wants to be in a constant flux and dangerous kind of state. So we need to be actively working towards protecting biodiversity, as it has such an important role in mitigating climate change.
Thank you very much, Claire, for highlighting that interconnectivity between climate change and nature. I think I read a report recently that said up to 37% of our solutions for climate might be nature-based. So it is key that we keep that in mind. Lincoln, do you have any reflections you'd like to add?
Thanks, Katie. I think that protecting natural capital and our biodiversity is not just important because it's literally responsible for everything in our lives, like the food we eat, the water we drink, and where we put our houses, but it's also ironically going to cause the most long-term business losses to the very industries that caused the biodiversity loss in the first place. For example, out of $210 billion are lost every year in food production due to biodiversity in a $500 billion industry, which accounts for a significant chunk of that industry. And to give like a more personal example in the work we do, back in Southeast Asia where we work with farmers, there's a region in Malaysia where the farmers there, they grow a very special type of high quality rice culturally that retails 5 times higher than usual. And what's happened is that they've started to realize the value of their crop, and so companies have started entering and started to commercialize the entire sector. Now, that's very good in the short term for the communities because they get to earn more and the companies profit from it. But what's happening is that there's now an issue of monocropping where they're growing too much of the same crop, and so it damages the biodiversity of the soil and the surrounding ecosystem. And so what will happen is that increasingly we can see that the production yields are dropping because of the degradation of biodiversity. And what will happen is that the qualities will also drop. So in the long term, everyone sort of loses because the companies will not have enough to sell and the quality will drop. The farmers will also lose their livelihoods. For consumers, we will also lose out, but we might not be affected directly, but for the people, the communities who've depended for years on this cultivation as their source of income and food, it will greatly impact their lives. And so it's a very poignant example of how everyone sort of loses if biodiversity is degraded and we don't take care of it.
Indeed, Lincoln, that's a point well made, particularly for financial services perspective, where these are the people and the businesses to which they provide their loans, their investment, their insurance. So there's a lot of exposure. Now, with that financial services perspective in mind, I wanted to ask, and I'll start with Patrick. Patrick, what do you think the role of financial services should be in tackling this nature challenge?
The role of financial services is naturally going to be in improving shareholder value and having that focus upon their clientele. Naturally, we can consider that working against private capital in order to moving capital into environmental causes could work, but we can work with them, not against them. It is no doubt that a variety of industries regarding fossil fuels and oil and gas and so forth, whilst renewables and sustainable industries will eventually be in. We must note that there is a material analysis to this that can explain this through lower return on investments, more effort to source analysis, more risk associated with the various firms that they're investing in, as well as skepticism over long-term viability. We have to consider, therefore, whether or not this is, there are questions of agency and associated with the actions of individuals within the financial services industry and the actions they take on a 9 to 5 basis and the long-term implications of these decisions. We always discuss climate change as a personal decision, and especially in the youth sector, we consider things like reducing meat consumption, waste-free clothing as being critical to long-term viability. Yet those in the financial service industry are seemingly unwilling to make those same sacrifices. The perception that we kind of see from our end. We may say this is something that you don't have control over. And as an example of that, there is the current issue in McKinsey, where over 1,000 employees have written a letter chastising them for working with 43 of the 100 biggest polluters on the planet, with some resigning as a result of making that personal sacrifice to see the change enacted. We must consider where these kind of questions of agency really come into effect, whether it is personal or systemic, and how we can really challenge the issues of the future if we don't have everyone on side or not standing up for what they truly believe in. If the effort is more systemic in nature, I'd love to hear what the panel would think about what they can do to improve their kind of company's culture, as we see a lot of talk about ESG values, but we don't see the benefits of those ESG values coming into the forefront.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Big challenge there. What are they actually going to do to walk the talk? Ben, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add to that?
I think it's as rightly noted, I think adjusting one's expectation of return to approach a long-term view and to encourage the acknowledgement of stakeholder capitalism. I think on a first note, we need to take an approach towards valuations and accounting metrics that sufficiently take into account the biodiversity and nature positive outcomes. There need to be methodologies in order to manage and report this so it sufficiently influences the valuations and how we look at recurring revenues when looking towards certain types of asset classes. I think within nature-based solutions and within natural capital, there needs to be a large push towards advocating policies to improve the sustainability of the revenue streams there. Regulation around carbon credits and alternative sources of revenue that can ensure the sustainability and the positive climate contribution of nature-based solutions and natural capital, I think, is essential. And this in lockstep with an approach to valuations and approach to accounting methodologies that truly take into account biodiversity and climate risk would improve the industry's approach to asset allocations in order to optimize it in accordance with these variables.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. And final word on this question from Tom. Tom, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add?
I think for me, finance has the same. One thing that was discussed when we were prepping for this was around how finance often doesn't feel like it has agency on this. And I think we all reacted quite strongly against that because you have so much agency. You have billions of pounds which you can mobilize on this. Capital really talks. A lot of the action that happens because capital is putting requirements on things, but also you can unlock so many positive things. So I'm working on a project that is youth-led at the moment in Coventry. That it would cost about £300 million to cover all the industrial buildings in Coventry in solar panels and bring a 7 times return. It's just building these capital vehicles that allow you to unlock this. For about £1 billion, you could turn all the farms in the UK, or all the livestock farms, into carbon negative units and get a 6-time return. But it's just mobilizing this capital to ensure you can get those returns in the long term. But actually, in terms of mobilizing that's where you guys come in. You have to be the activists and decide to make those longer term investments that have a positive impact on biodiversity, have a positive impact on the surrounding environment as well. You know, those turning farms to net negative also has a huge benefit in improving the biodiversity of the soil. It has a huge improvement in improving the amount of biome is how you improve biodiversity in many ways. And those are the benefits you can have and make more money from it.
Thank you very much for that. Some really important points made. And so moving on to our final question, an important one. I want to start, Ellie, with you, if that's okay, on this question, which is, how do you think youth activists should engage with financial services?
Yeah, definitely. I think, first of all, it's important to realise scale when we talk about youth activism around climate and biodiversity. A recent report in Lancet said that 80% of young people 16 to 25 are worried about climate change. And perhaps even more worryingly, the loss of biodiversity around the world, particularly in the UK, is being felt by our youth. 50% of children aged 5 to 16 it can't identify a stinging nettle, for example. That's the extent to which we're talking about biodiversity nature degradation. And it's a very worrying trend. In terms of how the financial sector can really interact with youth on this issue, I think it comes down to it's our generation that is affected by this, and it's no longer acceptable for the financial sector to say it's too hard or it's too difficult, or these are the challenges. It's time for us to really step up and solve the challenges, because the reality is that the longer that we dwindle and the longer that we, water down bold action on climate change and on nature and natural capital, the harder it gets, over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. There is no scenario in which waiting leads to an easier, better outcome in terms of climate science. I think it's also incredibly important to point out that young people really care about this issue. I know for, just on my part, I will not be working for any company when I enter the workforce that does not have ESG values at its core. I think that transition is incredibly important for businesses that are looking to source the best in the talent network moving forwards. And it's not something at all to be taken lightly. There's also the fact that our generation is now coming into usage of their own personal capital. And we have decisions about where we want to invest that, how we want to invest, and how we spend our money more generally. So I think, it makes sense from someone who is of the younger generation and does not have the incumbent 40 years of this is how we've always made profits, to really be part of that transition and say that moving forward, we need to be adaptable and we need to be bold and make change on how we are using our money and, where we best think that capital can be used. I think people have highlighted quite brilliantly that a lot of the natural capital and the value of that has been missed over the past 20 years. And it's really time to re-engage and to incorporate ESG values alongside a lot of the strategies that financial institutions are using in collaboration with youth and the upcoming generation.
Thank you very much, Ellie. And it's good to hear that youth voices will be coming up and making employment decisions and capital decisions with this in mind. That's what the world definitely needs. Lincoln, it would be great to hear your perspective on this.
Thanks, Katie. I think how financial services firms can engage youth activists is that, well, first you can hire them. So youth activists can be anyone who's just passionate about climate change, and I think many firms and even your firms and your own portfolio companies, it's no secret that many of them have made ESG commitments and net zero commitments. And so by hiring people who are inherently passionate, youths who are inherently passionate and motivated to drive change, it will help you achieve your own publicly committed goals easier, and also empower them to make the change within your organizations and show your portfolio companies you're serious about putting capital and serious about driving change within the industry. Because a quick example is that when BlackRock voted against the re-election of directors in the largest PPE provider due to ESG concerns in Asia, even though the vote still went through, it showed the company they were serious, and the company actually changed its practices, and many of its peers in its industry actually did change. So by having this top-down pressure as well as bottom-up approach with the people who are motivated, the youths working in the company, to keep them accountable, it actually becomes a powerful force for change. And I saw it when I participated in the EY Climate Change Board, where they had representatives from the top levels of the company together with youth representatives who were just starting out and working within the sustainability teams. You could see that they were motivated to work collaboratively to think of solutions that didn't just benefit the climate and biodiversity, but also benefited the company in terms of keeping in mind its profitability, its concerns, and its shareholders. So I think that that's a very good approach to take when thinking about how to engage with youths in order to drive change in natural capital.
Thank you very much, Lincoln. Message to unleash the voices of youth. I really like that. And we've only got about a minute left. So, Tom, do you have any final words to add before we close?
Yeah, I just think I agree with Lincoln. We need to redefine what a youth activist is. And everyone on this panel is a youth activist. But rather than maybe what XR or Fridays for Future are doing, which is maybe waving a placard about, which is very important, we also need the engagement. And in our careers, we're going to be saving huge amounts of CO2. And a lot of the action that we make, but also making the biodiversity improvements that are required. We need a regenerative century over the next 100 years to get to where the planet is still livable. And without that, we need the people who have the power, and that is us. That's you guys with the financial muscle to build that mechanism and to build those investments and invest as activists to make that change that gets us to a planet that is better. We're all individuals who don't want to die on a fiery planet, don't want to die on a dead planet, and we can make those actions. The biggest impetus for change comes from finance. To build that regenerative century, it can come from finance. I've worked in a lot of businesses, and that is where the impetus comes from, to build that change and to ensure we can get better biodiversity and just a better world, frankly, in the next sort of century. And that comes from thinking long term, but also thinking actively.
Thank you very much, Tom. A really important call there for a regenerative century. I really like that, and it will be a big challenge for the next panel. And to everyone who's watching, we are all activists. Not maybe all of us are youth activists, but we can all be activists. I would like to thank the panel today for your time and your thoughts and perspective. Really valuable. And I look forward to hearing the response from our financial services panel to all those big challenges you've laid down. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed those reflections from some of our youth activists in this space. Now that we're back in with the financial services panel members, I wanted to ask a few questions. And first and foremost, I want to start off with the big picture from the financial services perspective. And Simon, if I can turn to you for that, I'd love your reflections on what financial services need to think about when they're revisiting their strategy and thinking about how they can embed nature into it.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So I think the term it's complex comes often around nature, and I think we have to set it aside. There is adequate data for a financial institution to do a full balance sheet nature stress test today. We've just done, as Finance for Biodiversity, a top-down piece looking across 450 different development institutions. And actually, it's very simple at an aggregated level because one can look at sensitive sectors, fragile jurisdictions, largely because of weak environmental regulatory enforcement, and one very quickly doesn't take a bottom-up project view, but can get to a broad landscape view as to one's primary nature dependencies and impacts lie, and how that relates to a view of material risk. So that would be kind of one, which is there's nothing to stop you doing it today, and you will be asked for it quite soon. And I think the second round of the story is that, as Ruchi said, what do we mean by materiality? And surely nature impact per se is not material, though it may be relevant to society. And actually, what we see in the nature space is nature impact becoming material very quickly. Why? Because we see a raft of new regulations emerging, such as mandatory due diligence on deforestation coming out of Europe and the UK, that will make your impact on nature material from a regulatory compliance point of view much more quickly than we've seen any equivalent in the climate and carbon space specifically. Then thirdly, we see significant financial innovation already begin to emerge. And I'll give one example, which is many moves now to try and integrate natural capital into sovereign debt markets. In fact, in the context of the current emerging market sovereign debt crisis. So we see a number of countries beginning to formulate plans for issuing KPI-linked sovereign debt instruments linked to nature and performance, nature and climate performance, and looking for both creditors and also private investors that are interested in these hybrid models. They begin to emerge. So lots of financial innovation. And then finally, I would point to the ultimate arbiter of the existence of financial institutions, which is the citizens themselves. And we all know that the financial sector doesn't have money, except insofar as they have our money. And so the really interesting question is how digitalization in particular is beginning to change the dynamic relationship between citizens and essentially intermediaries, i.e. financial institutions, that are making the best possible use of our money in delivering the benefits that we're interested in, whether they're financial returns or other kind of returns. So in the EU, there's now a piece of legislation in place that requires pension funds to engage with pension policy holders around the use of their funds. And new approaches to digitalization in providing information to pension policy holders will increasingly activate them alongside some of the more corporate shareholder actions that we begin to see playing out. So I think there is a landscape of change from the sort of metrics side, through the financial innovation side, up to the regulatory side, and then ultimately back to a more empowered citizen that actually has the money themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And that is a really important point, actually, on the empowering of customer. And I'm not sure I've seen that many financial services firms really take that into consideration. And hopefully that will come through as a really powerful driver in this space, as you've indicated that it might, particularly given most people are starting to shift what they want to do with their finances to be much more ESG considerate. And hopefully nature will be a really important part of that E. But now we've thought about the strategy aspect and the big picture, I wanted to get down into the nitty-gritty a little bit more. And so, Frank, I'm going to turn to you and ask for your reflections and thoughts on what metrics and tools are available for firms to think about this in practice.
Sure, thanks, Katie. Yeah, that's something that we hear quite often, when we're talking with the analysts, the financial analysts who's they've been working sort of 6, 8, 9, 18 months on a big carbon indicators or carbon disclosure report, and coming out of it, they said it's just we're a bit overwhelmed with like all the different frameworks, different ways to measure and report our performance. And now they're throwing biodiversity at us. Like, where do we start? And I got to admit that it's frustrating for us. And we at Earth Knowledge, we've developed 300 and growing science-based indicators to help describe what's going on the planet and all the different interrelated Earth systems. And what we tell folks is, you don't have to start with all of them at once. Start with a handful. Start with those that are outgrowths of the carbon effort that you just did. I'm sure that with a carbon effort that you probably just conducted, you developed some plan to implement some kind of nature-based solution. Start with those nature-based solutions. Maybe they have to do with slowing land conversion or altering up the way you're doing land use, or maybe has some kind of a deforestation or forest restoration efforts or something like that. Find those indicators that most closely align with those, and start to come up with, the appropriate ways to monitor and measure and then consistently report back out your progress on that. And then it's not just measuring and monitoring and reporting constantly. It's like, how do we tie that? How do we tie the progress on these science-based targets, these key performance indicators? How do we tie that ultimately so that we know nature positive will somehow get related to profit positive, right? Because if all we're doing is measuring and reporting, but it's not changing the behaviors of the bottom line, we're just doing a lot of measuring and reporting. So, our recommendation with our partners and the work that we're doing with EY and Microsoft on this very effort is don't try to do it all at once. Take it in pieces. Don't start with all 300. Start with 5 or 6, and show the progress. And don't just make it about monitoring and reporting. Make it implementing the actions that ultimately will equate why the business is doing nature positive. It's ultimately to show that you could be nature positive and be profit positive at the same time.
Indeed, Frank, and that's a really important statement. Ruchi, I wondered if you've got anything else you wanted to add, information on the metrics and targets piece.
Sure. As firms consciously undertake sustainability, the analysis introduces a lot of complexity in terms of nuance and multiple iterations. Frank mentioned over 300 indicators. So where do you start? I wanted to mention a framework that we use at Microsoft with our customers. And it's a very simple matrix exercise that we use to prioritize a firm's sustainability investments. And we do it by comparing the sustainability investment in terms of the competitive advantage conferred versus the risk exposure. So the 4 categories we have are table stakes investments. What is everyone else doing that we have to do? Embedded sustainable values, external and downstream risk factors that we might not have control over, and immediate risks and opportunities. And once you think through that matrix exercise, we find that firms begin to understand where they are in the journey, and then they have a clear direction of where they can improve. So, we found that ultimately, if a firm makes sense across all of these 4 categories, they'll ultimately be able to establish a competitive advantage over the long term. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so, a great example of this is Unilever. When Paul Pullman became the CEO of Unilever, one of his first actions was to suspend quarterly earning guidance and publicly commit to a long-term strategy, foregoing a focus on short-term profits. And this deterred short-term investors, but it actually attracted patient capital that allowed him to turn around Unilever into the consumer giant and very venerable sustainable strategy that it has today. And it goes without saying that technology, I would be remiss not to mention this, that technology can enable all of this in whether it's IoT in terms of measuring energy consumption and water usage as a table stakes investment, or it's a collaboration platform that helps to embed collaboration and citizenship in the culture of a firm like Microsoft Teams has done at Microsoft.
Thank you very much, Ruchi. And what an important point in there. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And as we close off this panel, I wanted to just take that idea forward and say, from the youth panel, there was a call for a century of regeneration. And as we start this marathon, I wanted to get advice from each of you, just quick fire, on what you think the first action financial services firms should do as a takeaway from this session. And Frank, if it's okay, I'd want to start with you.
I would say commit to nature positive by 2030 and make it an action that permeates your entire organization. And start now. I know it's a regenerative century, but start today.
Indeed, important point. And Ruchi?
I would say that financial services firms should increase their stakeholder activism and drive real change and use that for the model that for the rest of their journey.
Indeed, and that's such an important point. Simon, finally over to you. Quick fire action.
Well, those two are absolutely right. I guess, assuming they're done deals, I would add that every financial institution should ensure that it is not unwittingly benefiting from environmental crimes in who it's lending and investing to.
And those are three really important points. From my perspective, the only thing I'd add is governance. Whenever I've worked with firms in the climate space, whenever it's not embedded fully into governance in a really meaningful way, that's when you see a lack of ownership and a lack of action. But I wanted to end this session by wishing everyone good luck with our journey towards the regenerative century. Thank you very much, and have a good evening and a good weekend.